Hi everyone, welcome to lecture 13 on basic inorganic chemistry. My name is Dr. Teresa Chimambam. Today we will cover the different ways used to analyze a sample. We will cover acids and bases, and we will also cover salts. So we start with different ways used to analyze a sample. Right, samples can be analyzed by determining percentage purity of the sample, and we can use acid-base titration to find percentage purity of a sample. So, one way of analyzing samples in the lab is by determining the percentage purity of that sample. Another way of analyzing samples in the lab is by determining the concentration in grams or moles or molarity of that sample. So, an acid-base titration is used to determine the concentration of an acid or base by exactly neutralizing the acid or base with an acid or base of known concentration. Acid-base titration makes use of the neutralization reaction that occurs between acids and bases. And it also makes use of the knowledge of how acids and bases will react if their formulas are known. So, acid-base titration allows for quantitative analysis of the concentration of an unknown acid or base solution. So these are some of the ways which we use to analyze samples in the lab. So we can either determine the percentage purity, or we can determine the concentration in grams or moles or molarity of the sample. Right. Now we look at acids. What is an acid? In chemistry, an acid is a chemical species that donates protons or hydrogen ions and or accepts electrons. So an acid can either donate protons or it can accept electrons. So acids are proton donors or electron acceptors. Most acids contain hydrogen atoms bonded that they can release to yield cations and anions in water. Examples of acids are H2SO4, which is sulfuric acid, HNO3, which is nitric acid, HCl, which is hydrochloric acid, and many others. We now look at bases. What is a base? In chemistry, a base is any compound that accepts protons or releases hydroxide ions in an aqueous solution. So bases are proton acceptors. Remember that acids are proton donors. Bases are proton acceptors. Bases are also referred to as alkalines. Examples are sodium hydroxide, which is NaOH, potassium hydroxide, KOH, lithium hydroxide, LiOH. These are just some of the examples of bases. Okay, so we now look at salts. A salt is an ionic compound which is made up of two groups of oppositely charged ions. So what it means is that a salt must contain a positive and a negative ions. So examples are sodium chloride. Sodium is the positively charged ion and chlorine is the negatively charged ion. Another example is potassium iodide. Potassium is positive, iodide is negatively charged. Another example is calcium carbonate. Calcium is 2 plus positively charged CO3. The whole of this is negatively charged. The same thing applies to copper sulfate. Copper is positively charged and SO4 is negatively charged. So any compound that contains two groups of oppositely charged ions is known as a salt. Okay, so now we look at Arrhenius acids and bases. What is an Arrhenius acid? An Arrhenius acid is a substance that dissociates in water to form hydrogen ions or protons. In other words, Arrhenius acids increase the number of hydrogen ions in water. An example is HCl. So when it dissociates in water, it will form this hydrogen ion. So this HCl is an example of Arrhenius acid. What is an Arrhenius base? An Arrhenius base dissociates in water to form hydroxide ions. So hydroxide ions are OH ions. So an example of Arrhenius base is sodium hydroxide. When it dissociates in water, it will form hydroxide ion. So this is an example of Arrhenius base. So bases form hydroxide ions while acids form hydrogen ions. So just remember that Arrhenius acids form hydrogen ions in water while Arrhenius bases form hydroxide ions in water. We now look at properties of acids. Acids produce hydrogen ion as hydronium ions in water, like we said earlier. It produces a negative ion too. For example, HCl will dissociate to form H plus and Cl minus. So an acid produces both hydrogen ion and a negative ion as well. So acids, they taste sour. Acids corrode metals. Acids react with bases to form salt and water. So an acid can react with a base, sodium hydroxide, to form salt and water. Remember already a salt contains two oppositely charged ions, so sodium and chlorine oppositely charged. And so this is an example of how an acid can react with a base to form salt and water. Right, we now look at commonly used acids. So some of the commonly used acids are hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, which is H2SO4, nitric acid, HNO3, and acetic acid. We also call acetic acid ethanoic acid. So now we look at characteristics of bases. Bases taste bitter. Bases feel slippery or soapy. They cause certain organic dyes to change color. Bases produce hydroxide ions in water. For example, as we have seen earlier, sodium hydroxide in water will dissociate to form Na plus hydroxide ion. So bases produce hydroxide ions in water. Bases react with acids to form salt and water. Example, this is a base. It reacts with an acid, hydrochloric acid, and it will form sodium chloride plus water. So sodium chloride is the salt. And we call this reaction neutralization reaction. Also, bases are also electrolytes. So these are some of the characteristics of bases. We now look at examples of bases. Some of the examples of bases are sodium hydroxide, NaOH, ammonia, NH3, potassium hydroxide, barium hydroxide, magnesium hydroxide, aluminum hydroxide, and many others. Okay, so let's test our understanding. Which is an acid or salt, and write the name. So KCl is a salt, potassium is positively charged, chlorine is negatively charged. So it has two oppositely charged ions. So this is a salt, and the name is potassium chloride. This is a base, sodium hydroxide. This is calcium hydroxide, a base. This is an acid, hydrochloric acid. And this is an acid, nitric acid. So this is the solution for the previous slide. So this is where I'm gonna end today's lecture. Please like this video and subscribe, and I will see you in the next lecture.